Hello everyone, welcome to today's Novedge webinar, Creating Large-Scale Environments with Forest Pack. Forest Pack Pro 5 is the most popular scattering plugin for 3ds Max in the Archviz industry, providing a complete solution for the creation of vast surfaces of trees, grass, and plants. Forest Pack has limitless application beside its namesake. In this presentation, iToo will use real case studies to go beyond their tool's obvious uses, demonstrating tips and techniques to illustrate boundless versatility for VFX, VR, real-time, and architectural visualization. Today's webinar presenter, Paul Roberts, is an experienced 3D environment artist and educator who has been working with 3ds Max for over 15 years as a 3D designer and lecturer for the games, product designs, and visualization industries. And now let me tell you a little bit about Novedge. Novedge is one of the largest online stores for design software. We offer a huge assortment of software solutions that cater to virtually every designer's needs. Come visit us at novedge.com and just browse our catalog for all your design tools. And for more daily software news and limited time promotions, always check out the Novedge blog and follow us on Facebook, Google+, or Twitter. Coming up next week, rendering inside SketchUp, CF for SketchUp and architecture rendering. Last but not least, today's webinar is free and is being recorded. So if you want to rewatch it, you can head on over to our Novedge's YouTube or Vimeo channels. And now I'll stop talking and pass the microphone and the screen to Paul, who's going to take it from here. Enjoy this great presentation.
Well, I'll jump in if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, so hi everyone, this is Jaime Parga, marketing manager. Barbara, thank you for the introduction, and thanks Novedge for hosting this webinar, and thanks everyone for showing up. Well, just a quick introduction for all of you that might not know it. We are a small company founded in Spain in the year 2000. So we've been in the market for 17 years now. Forest Pack came in pretty much with the foundation of the company, and RailClone, which is our second plugin, came in around 2009. We are Autodesk authorized developers pretty much since the beginning of the company, and we've been traditionally an Archviz company. Our clients, mostly 90% of our clients, have been related to visualization. That said, in the last year, we've been doing a lot of push towards the VFX market. We believe that in the future there's going to be a merge between gaming, VFX, and Archviz, and that's why we are so keen on showing other parts of the industry what the plugins can do. Basically, what we do, we solve problems because we help people to manage loads of geometry without, punching their computers and getting on their nerves. So the plugins pretty much help people to have a better day. And nothing else today. What we're showing is Forest Pack. It's going to be mostly based on VFX real case studies, but with huge applications on Archviz. And of course, if you have questions, just pop up and we will answer them and on the go. So Paul, please, passing to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jaime, for the intro. Hi, I'm Paul. I'm the training manager at iToo Software. I'm just going to give you a little rundown of what I want to do today because, as Jaime said, we're going to look at a couple of case studies of the use of Forest Pack in visualization, but with applications wherever you use Forest Pack. But before we do that, for people that maybe aren't as familiar with Forest Pack as others, or just get people up to speed, or just to maybe share a few tips for people that use Forest Pack but maybe are missing a few things. What I'd like to do first is to go over the basics and talk a little bit about what I think are the 5 need-to-know rollouts of Forest Pack. Forest Pack's it's a plugin, as Jaime said, that's been around since 1999, and in that time we've added a lot of features. So as a new user, I think it's helpful to understand what the most important things to look for when you start Forest Pack are and how you can get up and running really, really quickly. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this live and switch to 3ds Max. And I'm going to start with a real basic base scene. And hopefully by the end of this, you'd have an understanding of what Forest Pack does, the core features, and how you could use it really quickly. So in this scene, it's really basic. I've got a plane essentially here, and I've got a couple of splines that we'll use that are sort of designating areas in which we'd like to put some plants. So this green spline here is going to be some trees. This pink spline, that's going to be some grass. And then down this path, which is defined down the middle here, we want some dried leaves that have fallen off the trees and onto the ground. And hopefully in the next sort of 15 minutes, we can get all that done, and I can show you some tricks along the way. So first of all, if you're completely new to Forest Pack, you'd need to know how to create one. And the easiest way is just to pick Forest Pack from the Modify panel or the Creation tab on the side here. And then you would just pick an object in the scene on which to scatter objects. Now, it could be this surface, which would fill this whole area, or in this case, maybe it's just one of these splines, and we'll create the grass first. So I would want to pick this pink spline here, which is the grass spline. But just to make sure I can pick it, I'll switch to Shape Step here. So I've got it picked up here, and I'll click it in the scene. So now we've created our first scatter, and it's really as easy as that. As always, with everything in Forest Pack, it's fully parametric. So if I change or move the spline, everything updates accordingly. And we want to create this grass in the quickest way possible. So I'm going to just select the Forest Pack object. Help if I didn't have shape selected. There we go. Select the Forest Pack object. And the first rollout that I think we want to worry about is the geometry rollout. So this is the first of our 5. Now the geometry rollout is where you decide what it is that you're actually going to scatter. And before we get into picking anything from the scene, the easiest way to quickly create grass here is to use the library. So you just pick this library, and in here we've got various objects built in that you can use. So for example, we've got 3D objects that come included with the software, like flowers and grass and stones. You can also add third-party libraries to this library, which will integrate with it, so you can easily pick them off. So we've got Evermotion catalogs integrated. We've got Laubwork in here, Evermotion again, MaxTree, VisPark, and HQ Plants. All of those are in there. And then included again with the Forest Pack library, we've got this separate category called presets. And now these are a little bit different from the other objects we've seen, because not only do these contain the geometry that you need to scatter, but they also contain the settings for the whole of the Forest Pack object. So instead of having to pick some geometry and then mess with things here, these are kind of as close to a one-click solution as you're going to get. So we want grass. All you need to do is in the presets rollout here, just find a grass that you like. I'm going to go for wild grass, and just hit import selected. And then that pops the grass into your scene. And it's really pretty much as straightforward as that. What you'll see now in this geometry rollout, which we're talking about, is 3 patches of grass here. And below each one of these, you've got the settings for the grass itself. And I don't want to talk too much about this now, but I will mention the probability because that's a useful one. So to help visualize this, I'm going to go to the display rollout, and I'm just going to turn on use color ID here. And what that does is it changes the points cloud display, which is a way of displaying millions of polygons in the viewport very easily. And what it's done is it's tinted the points cloud using these color swatches here. That's a really handy way of visualizing exactly what's happening in your scatter. So for example, if I wanted to make fewer of the wild patch of grass, which has got the pink color ID here, if I wanted fewer of those in the scatter, I could select that, and I can come down and I can change its probability. And you'll see that in real time, the number reduces. Same with the other colors. Like so. So that's a really handy one. So this is all well and good. This is our first scatter on grass and the surface. And if I go to the camera view, we can see that's working well. But this surface is, of course, is very flat, which is almost never the case in real life. Of course, this ground is going to be slightly undulating. And of course, if it's undulating, it's going to push up through these grass layers. So we need to make sure this grass conforms to this surface, which will take me to my second important rollout, the surface rollout. Now, the surface rollout allows you to add one or more 3D objects on which to scatter the grass. All you need to do is click on the plus sign and pick it from the scene, like so, and then it wraps around the object. And it's pretty much as straightforward as that. Notice that I'm using the surface in conjunction with a spline. So the surface to define the position on the Z-axis of the grass, and then the spline to define the actual area in which the scatter takes place. Now, another important thing that I want to point out here, and I'll just switch the color ID off and change the display mode to pyramids for a second, in the surface rollout, is the way in which these rotate to follow the surface's normals or don't. By default, these objects are pointing straight up. I mean, they're randomized a little bit, but they start off pointing straight up, which is usually the case, or usually what you'd want for trees and things like that, where you'd want them to point to the sky. But for ground cover, more often you'd want it to follow the contours of the ground. And that's what this little direction slider here is all about. So if I bring this down, it's hard to see on these small triangles, but if I bring this down to a 0, to where it says normal, now those pyramids and these scattered objects are following the contours of the ground, and that's what we want for this. So that's a really important one for ground cover. I'll just change my display back to points cloud mode. So those two rollouts were the geometry for picking your objects, and then the surface rollout for applying surfaces onto which the objects will stick. Also, you have the areas rollout, and the areas rollout is where you define the scatter areas. So the areas that will actually create geometry. And you can see at the moment, I've got the surface area in here, which is being used to position it on the Z-axis. And also I've got the spline. You'll notice that the surface is off, but if I turn it on, you can see what happens. It scatters absolutely everywhere. So like I say, turn it off and it's only being used to position it. We can add various other area types here, including, for example, objects. So say I wanted to exclude the grass from under these seats, I can pick a 3D object from the scene. These are all linked to these benches. And then I will just add a little bit of exclude fall off, and I can pull the plants away from around those seats, like so. So that's really handy. So I can very easily add things over the top of this and remove plants from underneath them. And it's all fully automatic, parametric too. So I can move these around and you can see it affects the scatter in real time. So let's call the grass done and add the leaves. So we'll add another Forest Pack object here. And once again, I'm going to, this time I'll pick the surface first. Then come into the geometry rollout. And again, I'm going to use a library because in our library, we have some presets for leaves. So I'm going to pick maple leaves. They're already brown and these are maple trees we're going to add. So now I have maple leaves everywhere, but we just want them along the path really. So coming back to the areas rollout, remember areas is how you define the scatter area. I'm going to turn off surfaces because I do need it for the Z position, but I don't need it to define the area. And instead I'm going to add a spline. I've got a spline down here I'm going to use, but I've been kind of lazy and only done the bit nearest the camera. So you can see it just kind of stops, which isn't what we want. So I could add another area by just coming into my spline tools and drawing one out. Or if I want to be a bit more interactive than that, we could use another type of area, which is a paint area. And this basically lets you brush on the scatter wherever you want. So you just click this to add a paint area. Click the brush painting tool there, and then change the size by clicking on the brush options. So I can bring this down to say 3.5. It's a bit big at the moment. And then paint. And you can see it's really easy just to paint in some leaves wherever I want them. Like so. So a lot of people who've used Forest Pack before are probably familiar with paint areas, but you may not know that with paint areas, you can still convert them back to splines and edit them with the spline tools. And this is really easy to do. You just click convert to spline here and nothing changes, but this paint area is now selectable, and it's as you can see, it's just an editable spline, and you can go in and just edit it using your standard spline tools, just as though it were any other spline. And again, the scatter updates in real time. If I come back to Forest Pack, I can select it. If I come back to Forest Pack into the areas rollout and this paint area, and I want to keep painting on it, I don't need to create a new paint area. I can just convert it back to a paint area and then just keep going even after I've edited it. So that's pretty handy. So we've got our leaves in there, and we've got some grass. Let's add some trees. I'm going to do the trees a little bit differently because I'm not going to use a library object for this one. I'm just going to pick one from the scene. So trees, I'm going to pick the surface again, scatters everywhere, and come into the areas rollout and turn off the surface, and then pick this green spline down here. So now I've got my trees. Now in the geometry rollout, I want to pick an object from the scene. There's already a default item here, which is this billboard. I'm just going to swap it for a custom object. Now this tree here is just standard geometry in the scene. And an important thing about Forest Pack is that unless you need to use them for reasons of keeping your scene file size low, there's not really an advantage to using proxies, because Forest Pack will automatically convert this to instances in the background on the fly. So I don't need to make this a Corona or a V-Ray proxy. I can just pick it from the scene. And there you go, it's in there. I'm just going to change the display mode so that it's not using the color ID, so we can see the materials on the trunk and the leaves, and switch to the camera view. Now, one thing that's obvious, even from this point cloud display, is that this single tree is obviously repeating. The trunk's all going in the same direction, they're all the same height, and so on. So this brings me to my next important rollout, which is the transform rollout. And we can use this to add lots and lots of randomization to this tree to help disguise the repetition. So we can randomize the translation, which I'm not going to worry about for now. But we can also randomize the rotation. So if I turn this on, immediately some of that repetition will be disguised. And the defaults are generally pretty good, but hey, this is a windy park, so these trees are going to be falling over a little bit more. I'm going to go -15, 15, and -15, 15 on the X and Y. And then we also can randomize the scale, and this gives you a lot of, this really helps to disguise the repetition. And I'm going to really push this. So at the moment, the scale's defaults 80 to 100%. I'm going to push it up to 250. So we've got massive variation in those trees now. So the transform rollout really helps you there. If I come back out to the main view, we can see now I've increased the size of those trees. The density of them is a little bit high. So we need to prune a few of those. We need to create a more sparse density there. And that brings me to another rollout, which is the distribution map rollout. And this is how Forest Pack chooses to place these trees. And the crucial principle to understand here is that basically what's happening is we have a black and white bitmap here being projected down onto this scene. Where there's a white pixel on this bitmap, you'll get a tree. And where there's a black pixel, you'll get no tree. And that's really how the patterns are created. So all of these presets up here are basically black and white bitmaps, white pixels for trees, black pixels for spaces. And if I play with these, you can see I'll get different patterns. And of course, because it works that way, you can easily create your own bitmaps and pop them in there as BMPs, or you can use any map that 3ds Max is able to process in the viewports, not at render time. You can use any map in there. So I'm going to stick with the dense for now, but like I said, it's too dense. It's too many trees. So the way that this bitmap is placed on this scene is controlled by these density settings here. And basically what I'm doing by changing this number here, this density units value, is I'm changing the scale of that map. And by making it larger, I'm putting less trees in there. So now I've just thinned that out a little bit. So now I've got some trees. They're all randomized and looking good. So you'll notice that up here near the camera, I haven't got any trees yet. The scatter area falls a little bit short. And that's because I thought, well, Well, this is the area that's in focus. So this is probably the area we're going to want to art direct the most. And so sort of the finishing touches generally of a project are that you probably go in and manipulate a few of the trees manually. And the nice thing about Forest Pack, even if you don't use the scatter settings, you can still use the instancing power to place individual trees. So you do this by just going into the trees sub-object mode and switching it into tree editor mode. Then what I can do is I can select and move and transform individual trees. So I could, for example, pick a tree and hold down Shift and clone it so it's down nearer the camera over here. And then easily rotate it or scale it till it's the size that I want. But another thing you can do in tree editor mode is you can actually put trees on markers that have been imported. Maybe you've got a landscape plan that has markers for specific plantings. You've been sent them by your landscape architect or your architect, and you need them to be placed quite precisely. So in that case, you can use these markers to plant individual trees. And you do that in the tree editor rollout. And you come down to reference objects, leave it on pivot, go to select objects, and just pick the objects in the scene that you want to add a tree to. Make sure you turn off delete existing items, or I'll lose all my nice trees that I've already created, and hit create. And you should see a tree pop up on each one of these here. There we go. And of course, these can still be further edited. So I can come in here and rescale these. Maybe these are a bit big near the camera. I want to bring them down a bit to create more of a canopy. So we can sort of come in here from the camera view and scale these down so they're the right size and so on and so forth. So there we've sort of gone through the sort of basics of Forest Pack. So the crucial rollouts there are the geometry, the areas, the distribution map, surfaces, and transforms. They're the 5 you really need to concern yourself with. Tree editor is a bonus. Once you've got to this point, you can render your scene and you'll get something sort of similar to this, but there's a level of randomization that's still missing from this scene, and that's on the leaves. So Forest Pack also comes with a procedural map that works in tandem with the data structures that Forest Pack's able to provide. And it's able basically to randomize bitmaps. So this is forest color here. It has 10 input slots, 20 will be 20 in Forest Pack 6, and it has the ability to randomly tint those maps too, which actually you can see in this image. There's some tinting going on. By just turning on these mapped inputs, I'm able to randomize between these 6 maps, and each one of these has a probability. But the important thing here is this little drop down. You can choose between randomizing by item, and what will happen then is that each individual tree will take one of these bitmaps. So one tree will get this one, maybe one might get this one, and so on and so forth. And that can be quite nice in some circumstances. But for this case, in this case, we want to use element. And what element does is it randomizes each individual leaf in this scene. So each individual leaf on each one of these trees will take a randomized map from here, from this selection of 6, using these probability settings. And then once you've done that, you'll get something more like this, which is our finished sort of autumn scene. I'm not rendering here, obviously, for time reasons, but this is about how long it takes to create this scene. It's just sort of 15 minutes, something like that. And that sort of pretty much covers the sort of basics. And what I'd like to do now is to show a few more of the more advanced features and the application of some of these in the real world using a couple of case studies by visual effects studios, but they're equally applicable to whether you're doing architecture or whatever. So I'm going to talk first of all about a project by Makuta Visual Effects, which was actually the most expensive, I think, until maybe the sequel came out, visual effects film in India, for which Forest Pack was used extensively, and then Lux Studios' use of Forest Pack for the presidential rally scenes in Independence Day Resurgence. But I'm going to follow the same pattern in both, in that before talking about the specific case studies, I'm going to go over the kind of core principles that they used, using some simplified examples, and then show their application afterwards. So that's what I'm going to plan to do next. Please feel free to send any questions about the first part, and I'll answer them at the end before I move on. Okay, so what I want to do first of all is to look at the quick creation of cities as an example before we move into the Makuta thing. A lot of our clients have told us that they're using Forest Pack to quickly create background cities to fill in the mid to background of either architecture or visual effects shots. Buildings like trees can have enormous poly counts, and so it's advantageous to be able to scatter a lot of them and randomize them so that you can disguise the repetition a little bit too. But there are ways maybe that you want to group them together, and that's what I want to show now. So using this kind of hypothetical example, I've got 3 types of building in this city. Just to keep it simple, there are obviously lots more you should have. And in each type, I've got several species, several examples. So for example, I've got sort of 10 types of skyscraper. I've got a few types of tall residential office, and I've got some industrial, low-level industrial buildings. Let's assume that your city is zoned so that we've got the skyscrapers roughly in one place, the residential offices in one place, and the industrial stuff in one place too. And what we want to do is to be able to place those, but not necessarily to have to paint them manually, because that can take time, and this is just for filling in the back to mid-ground distance. So what we can use is diversity modes. And diversity modes are in the distribution map rollout that we just saw. And they're at the bottom here, and by default it's on random, which is what we saw with the trees and grass and everything else. But if we switch to clusters, you can see now that we're getting groups of buildings. Obviously they're just displaying as boxes in the viewport, but we're getting groups of buildings here. But what we're getting at the moment is we're getting one group for each individual building that was in that geometry list. So each group here is one type of skyscraper. Despite the fact they're separate heights, that's just because we've randomized the transforms. That's one type of skyscraper, that's one type of skyscraper, that's one type of industrial building. And what we want is for each one of these clusters to contain all the types of skyscraper. One cluster to contain all the industrial buildings and one cluster to contain the residential. Here's how you do it. It's pretty straightforward. Basically what you do is you select all your skyscrapers, for example, and you just change the color ID for all of them so that it's the same. And then you do the same for residential, change the color ID so that it's the same, and the same for the industrial buildings. And basically what the clusters feature does is that it groups together buildings with the same color ID. So as well as being a handy way, that color ID, to just see what's happening in your scatter, it's also got a useful function here in that you're able to group together buildings of the same type. This clusters feature also has parameters here so that you can change the roughness of the shape of the cluster. You can blur the edges so that they bleed into one another. There's an overlap as opposed to just a hard finish. And there's also a noise feature there too. So you can add random buildings from other clusters into the middle of a different cluster. So you can create a little bit of chaos within that clustering. Excuse me. And then another thing is the buildings, we don't generally want them to collide visibly. So we have this collisions option too. And Forest Pack creates a spherical collision volume around each object based on the bounding box size. And you can use that to make sure that buildings, or minimize the amount that these buildings intersect. And you can change those properties from this rollout as well. And then once you've done that, you can just sort of change the clusters around till you get a good view from the viewport, hit render, and you're good to go. So this feature was originally designed actually not for buildings at all. It was designed to simulate the way that plants grow. When a plant grows, it tends to drop its seeds nearby, and then more plants of the same species pop up. So that's its original application, but we've since found it's quite useful for this too. And there's another tutorial on the website if you're interested, where we've used the same feature to create green walls, where you get this kind of distinctive green wall pattern where you get these patches of the same species of plant. And it's a handy way to very quickly make vertical green walls and that sort of thing as well. So that's quite handy. So that's good for background stuff. For foreground stuff, or things where you need more precise placement, clusters may not work for you. And what you might need to do is to paint the position of those buildings instead. And this is where the second diversity mode comes in, which is called match color ID on map, which is just above where I'm waving the mouse. There we go. And basically what you do there is you just pick a map from the scene, or add a map to the scene, to the map slot there. And it's going to use the colors applied to that map to place the objects. And in this example, I'm using viewport canvas just to paint them so that I can see what it is in the viewport. But of course, it's not necessary to use viewport canvas. You can paint them in Photoshop or Affinity or whatever you want, or use vertex colors even. Any of that's fine. But you can see what's happening here is that I'm just painting these colors that we set earlier. So red for the skyscrapers. I think blue was industrial, as I remember. And then green was going to be the residential. You'll notice with viewport canvas that it doesn't update until I deselect the paintbrush. This is just a limitation of Mac. So in order to see the results, you have to deselect the brush to see what's happening there. And you can of course use any of these, so you can create a kind of distribution map type effect as well by creating little splotches as opposed to solid colors, and then you can get some buildings that are spaced apart and that kind of thing, or you can mix the colors together to create a bit of noise. Those we'll see in a minute, that's not necessary. But you can do a lot with this, and this is some very rough painting. What we'll see in a minute is some very precise painting and how this was used in production. So this is what I was talking about here. There's a noise parameter too, so even on top of this, you don't need to manually add noise to that. You can just turn up the noise value and you'll get some random buildings popping up in each color too. So that was my crude, these are the principles example. This is an application of that. This was, like I say, this was a project that Makuta Visual Effects contributed to. The film was called Bahubali. It was a big film in India. It has had an international release. And this city in particular was an interesting project for the use of Forest Pack. It's actually 10 kilometers by 6 kilometers in size, so it's huge. There are about 400 building types in there, and I think 50 or more species of plant as well as people, birds, horses, all sorts, shrines, all kinds of stuff, all scattered in this city. And the reason I showed you all that stuff I just showed you is that the way this was all placed on this environment was using custom painted diversity maps, matching the color IDs to painted maps. And so the way this was done was to first of all render a base map from the top view in 3ds Max, and these are rendered at 10K. And 10K is important in this case because they need the detail, the resolution to be able to paint that detail into individual streets, individual areas. But this is also nice because it gives you an idea of just how much is scattered. You can see the bare bones of the city here, but there's a lot that's missing. And then on top of this, I think there were 30 forest objects, each with their own diversity maps. And I've got some of them composited together here that I can show you. I couldn't tell you exactly what each color does, but you can get a sense of the way these cities were laid out. So here, for example, is the distribution on the back mountains away from the city. And you can see for the most part, the green section is foliage, randomized foliage. But there is a blue section here too, where you can start to see some small settlements starting to appear. And similarly, if we go to the lower terrain, the other side of the city, we can see foliage, but here we can definitely see the clustering and the yellow sections of small villages and groups of people and that sort of thing. And this is all, like I say, this was all hand painted, certainly not using viewport canvas at 10K. This was hand painted in Photoshop above that base map. As we move towards the center of this city, we start to see very clear street layouts. So again, hand painted layouts for these streets to create the kind of urban patterns you would expect to see, mixtures of buildings and trees and everything else. And as we move into the center, we really start to see how this goes. Here we see them all composited, and here we see it on top of the distribution base map. So we can see the layout created with Forest Pack using that painted technique on top of this city. And here's another view of that enormous city with all the scattered objects in there. In addition to the city created with Forest Pack, Makuta also created a 1.5 kilometer tall waterfall, which was surrounded by vegetation, both on the cliff faces as well as in the surrounding hills and mountains. And also they did what was dubbed internally as their Tarzan scene, which was the same location actually, but because of the close-ups, they treated it as a different sequence. And this was a very lush jungle scene, which had not only all the trees and vines and everything scattered with Forest Pack, but actually the details on the trees also scattered with Forest Pack. So you'll see in this short clip in a minute, there's There are close-up trees with all kinds of ivy and moss and mushrooms and all sorts growing on them. And essentially to create that, they used a mixture of the diversity maps we've just seen to get the exact placement, but also the surface tools. We saw earlier in the first part of this tutorial, this presentation, surface is just being used to project geometry down on the z-axis, but you can also project geometry from sort of 360 degrees. So you can use the UVs essentially to scatter all around an object, and you'll see how that's used now. I'm going to play this. I suspect it may not stream perfectly, in which case you can see this video on our website, but it's about 2 minutes, so yeah, hopefully you can get some sense out of how this looks. So I'm told you haven't got sound at the moment. There's a very nice soundtrack on this video that unfortunately you can't hear because it only transmits to my microphone, but
no, we don't have
hum along
sounds,
for a couple of
but
minutes.
those images speak for themselves.
So here we can see the shot we were just talking about, fully animated, and some of the close-ups too. You can see in some of these shots people that I'm told were scattered with Forest Pack as well, crowds, and obviously the surrounding trees and landscapes. This sort of scene just wouldn't be possible really without Forest Packs, just the sheer amount of geometry. Interestingly as well, this project was rendered with Mental Ray, which we often surprised that people were using Mental Ray, and for big films like this to be using it was an eye-opener for us, because we're used to architects, there are a lot of V-Ray users. Here we can see the crowds being added that we were talking about, as well as the foliage in the center of the city. So this is why these maps were 10K, so that we could get in there and get this kind of detail that was needed for these close-up shots. Okay, so from Makuta, I wanted to move on to another scene that has just a ridiculous amount of geometry, and talk a little bit about the way that Forest Pack can handle animation. Again, looking at it from a visual effects context, but anyone who does animation as part of their pipeline will find this useful. And also, animation can be a useful way to randomize trees as well. If you have a grow effects object, for example, that's able to create multiple trees by changing the seed, you can animate that seed and then randomize it in the scene to create multiple tree variations without actually having to create multiple tree variations, if that makes sense. And there's a tutorial for that on our website if you're interested. So even if you're doing stills, these animation modes can be kind of handy. So let's have a look at that. Just like before, I want to talk about some principles before I move on to the application. So I'm going to show you the 4 animation modes that are in Forest Pack available to you. They're in another rollout animation that we didn't talk about earlier, and you can see the 4 here. 5, I'm not counting 5 because that's just no animation. So there are 4 animation modes. And for this example, I'm going to use this super high poly tree. which is beautifully animated. So it's got a basic kind of growth animation and then a kind of noise applied to it to imply that there might be some wind or something, but it's just to illustrate. And first of all, the simplest animation mode using this tree is called follow geometry, and all that happens there is that all of the objects are in sync when they animate. So they're all basically following the source object, which is off screen somewhere. As that animates, so do all the instances. It's pretty straightforward. But where it gets really interesting is when you use random samples. So random samples, I'm going to pause the video to explain this one. Random samples has two parameters down here, one which is time offset and one which is count. Count basically tells you how many different variations of this animation you want. So if you were to change this to 10, which I'm about to do, you would get 10 different randomly animated trees. The time offset governs the number of frames between each sample. So when I change it in a minute to a count of 10 and a time offset of 5, I'm going to get samples on frame 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, and so on. So just let that play. And now you can see the growth is randomized and the kind of wind animation is all slightly offset. And this is really handy if you've got a much nicer animated tree than this one, like another Grow Effects wind animated tree, for example, because you can create a really nice forest animated with wind running through it without having to create loads and loads of different assets. So this is the same mode again, it's just on repeat. So the second one is random from map, third one, sorry. And this uses the same offset, but instead of randomly placing them, it uses a black and white map to choose where the offset is placed. So instead of being randomized, it's using a map. And that's how we can see them appearing from the back of the screen there. I'll just let that run one more time so we can see it. And the crucial thing here is that once the animation continues, so it's not a literal, it's not that the map is controlling the absolute frame of the animation, it's just choosing when to offset them. If you wanted to control the absolute frame of animation so that the animation changes as the map changes, then you would use the next mode, which is frame from map mode. So frame from map mode uses also a grayscale, but now we have a start and an end point, and the grayscale map has to change in order for the animation to change. You can see here it's locked in because I've got this gradient ramp in here, and because the gradient ramp isn't changing, the animation isn't changing. However, if I were to animate the offset of the map, then you can see the animation also updates. So that's how that works. And those are your four animation modes. There's actually a little bit more to it than that, because as well as the 4 animation modes, in Forest Pack 5, we included a new feature called Forest Effects. And what Forest Effects allows you to do essentially is to extend Forest Pack with your own custom features. And it does this using some pretty basic sort of expressions, really. So with Forest Effects, what you're able to do is to add new features, like a new animation mode, for example, that doesn't exist in Forest Pack. And so I'm just changing a few things here, and I've got a forest effect that's going to basically control the animation instead of using a map or anything else, based on its proximity to the edge of a spline. So here we have the effect. If I turn it on, we've got this spline animating in from the right, and as it animates in, you can see the trees grow. And it's because they are only at full height when they are near the middle of the spline, basically furthest away from the boundary spline. So you could hypothetically create a river simulation that flows in, and then because of the water source, the trees grow out from that water source. And of course, lots of other possible animation modes would be doable with Forest Effects. This is just one example of how you can extend it. So how was this used? Well, it was used extensively by Lux Studios to create the presidential rally scenes and a few other things in Independence Day Resurgence. And I just want to take you through not just the use of Forest Pack, but a few of the other things that Lux did to create this scene. And I want to start by talking about the actual assets that they generated for this, because I think what's interesting, talking about using visual effects techniques in other disciplines, what's interesting is that they really did manage to use some very accessible techniques that most people would be able to do, even for this film. So this scene actually combines two of our plugins, Forest Pack and RailClone. I'm not going to talk much about RailClone today, but we are going to do a future webcast where you can learn more about that, so stay tuned for that. But in this scene, it's used everywhere. So, for example, what's blue is RailClone and what's orange is Forest Pack. So RailClone is a modular modeling tool. It's great at distributing small repeatable bits of geometry, so it's great for modeling buildings. And Lux used it to model building components in this. We talked already about how Forest Pack can be used for scattering buildings earlier on. So here's an example of where that was done. Lux did some set extensions by scattering buildings with Forest Pack. RailClone is used for this monorail that flanks both sides of the presidential rally. It's a perfect example for RailClone because it's got repeating segments and it's got a very clear rule set to help define it. And also RailClone has this the same instancing power as Forest Pack. And so although we're far away from this at the moment, if you're getting close, there's a lot of geometry in this monorail and RailClone can handle that. Of course, it wouldn't be Forest Pack if there weren't plants and trees. So all the plants and trees in this scene are Forest Pack. RailClone for the bleachers for the same reasons. It's a modular, repeatable component that is high poly, so it's great for that. And then, of course, the crowds, of which there are a lot, 200,000 people. There are 24 billion polygons in just the crowd. So Forest Pack was used extensively for that, not just to scatter them, but also to randomize them. But before we do that, let's look a little bit at how Lux managed to capture the animations for the crowd, because what was interesting to me about this was that they used very simple technology, something that's in most people's front rooms. They used Connect Scanner, and they used IPI Mocap Studio, which is an inexpensive motion capture tool that uses the Connect. So this was literally set up in the corner of their studio, and they got their team members to capture the animations that they needed to recreate this scene. These were then applied to bipeds, which again is technology that's available to us all. So mocap applied to bipeds. It's been cleaned up, obviously, and worked on a little bit, but it's not out of this world technology. They had their own tool, which you can see here, which helped to apply the motion capture clips to various different and randomize between the different models and the motion capture clips to create more variety, as I understand it. And Lux have, obviously, like most big studios, their own tool sets. So once they had their characters motion captured, they had their 3D people, which I think there were about 30 different models only, and they had their various mocaps applied to those. Then they added them to Forest Pack. And interesting to go back to really the basic stuff at the beginning, because that's all this is. They've got the characters added to the geometry rollout, just like we added the tree earlier. And then we're scattering people there. Pretty straightforward. Looks like a sort of density map, but that's how that works. And then, just like we saw with the leaves earlier as well, Forest Pack was also used to randomize the clothing on the characters so that the clothing didn't obviously repeat, or we could disguise the fact that it was the same model, same 30 models being used multiple times. So this is an example of how that can be done, not the only way, and possibly not exactly the way they did it. But this is a pretty simple setup where we've taken the original diffuse map for these models, and these were, like I say, I think off-the-shelf 3D characters. We've put that into a forest color map here, and over here on the right-hand side, we're using the tint override settings. So what this lets me do is to tint the original map using either a gradient, which you can see there is a kind of orange, or below that, get color from map is selected. And what that does is it searches this map here, which is on the left, which is plugged in to the forest color map. It searches that map and it picks a random pixel. It uses the color of that pixel and blends it with the original diffuse map using whatever blending mode we've got selected over here, which in this case is color. And then, of course, we can mix that back with the original diffuse map, just with a mix and a mask, like so. So that's a pretty straightforward way of creating color variations for these characters. What I haven't done here, which of course you could very easily, is to plug in actually completely different fabric textures into the map slots on the right hand side here. So we could have 10 textures as well as the tint randomization, and that would give you some nice variety. So then here we can see some of the resultant animations that they created in the studio. What's interesting is to create randomization even before we get into Forest Pack. What the team did was they recorded the same motions, but different team members did it, and they did it multiple times. So obviously by dint of repetition and because of having different team members, there were very slight changes in the various motion capture files, even though they were ostensibly doing exactly the same thing. So before we even randomize the offsets, we've got some variation in there. And then these are added to Forest Pack, and we can use the animation modes we just saw in our basic low poly example. And the mode chosen this time, of course, was random samples with a tint offset, a random samples time offset of 1 and a count of 20 in my example. And then we can see the difference. So this is not mock-up of that. This is how this looks with follow geometry on. So they're all operating at the same time. Only one motion capture sample this time. Pretty creepy. And then if we change the animation mode here to random samples, and then again, it's got time offset of 1. So there's only 1 frame between these samples. It's not a lot. And then count 20 to 20 samples, 1 frame apart. And then we play that. Immediately, it's more natural. And if you times this by lots of different characters, 30 different characters, texture variations, different motion capture clips applied to those as well, we're getting a huge amount of variety. And you end up with the final thing, which is what I'll show you now. Again, there probably won't be sound, I'm afraid, but we will be able to see how it looks, hopefully. So like I say, there's trees, buildings. That monorail in the foreground there is RailClone. So this is why we needed the fairly high-res geometry. Here we see the build-up of the presidential section and just the sheer amount of characters, all of which in this low-res sort of playback, you can't really see it, but they're all animated. It's a bit clearer in these close-ups where you can see them waving their arms and flags and things in the background here too. I've actually paused this a few times and had a look, and if you look quite carefully, you can spot the repeating characters by their faces and that kind of thing. But it's just in the context of the film, no one's really going to do that, so it's disguised enough. And a big thanks to Lux Studios for letting us share that and talking to us about their process, and Makuta as well, both of whom have been very kind to give us some information about how they do things. So those were my 2 case studies and an introduction to the plugins. I would ask now if you've got any questions. If there are any questions, I will happily answer them. And just say in advance, big thank you for watching. Also, if you haven't used Forest Pack before and you want to give it a try, there is a free light version that you can download and use even commercially from our website. It's got more or less all the features. It's just a few limitations, but it's certainly useful in production. So you can give that a go. Any questions?
No, we're still waiting for questions. I have one though. This light version for download,
Yeah.
is it a time constrained download? Will it expired?
No, it's
Okay.
completely unlimited. It's
Okay.
completely unlimited. You can use it forever. It has more or less all the features. What it doesn't have is the ability to scatter on undulating surfaces. And you're limited to 3 objects, I think, that you can scatter, 3, plants or whatever you put in there. But that's more or less it in
Okay,
terms of
cool.
limitations. So it's pretty featured. It's certainly useful for a lot of things.
Sounds fun. Check it out.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
there's one question. So now in
Great.
2018, when Mental Ray is not a part of 3ds Max, is Forest Pack Pro supporting Mental Ray and iRay?
Okay, yeah, good question. At this point, the Forest Pack in 2018 does not support Mental Ray. Supports V-Ray, obviously. It doesn't support Mental Ray in 2018 only. In previous versions, in 2017, 16, and so forth, Mental Ray is supported. So we're basically following the support of Mental Ray in 3ds Max and monitoring the situation for interest. So if you feel like it's something you need, then I would email us and be vocal about it, because we know from statistics that we had very few Mental Ray users anyway, but obviously there are people out there using it, as we saw with Makuta. So please let us know.
Cool. Yeah, speak up, contact them, iToo, and I'm sure they'll be happy to hear about their users. And yeah, we have a few minutes, guys. So, okay, if companies like Makuta will render the VFX in Mental Ray, would they be forced to be switched to other renderers to use Forest Pack?
The question is whether they would upgrade to
Yeah.
2018, which doesn't have Mental Ray. So for as long as they stay on a version of 3ds Max that uses Mental Ray, they'll also be able to use Forest Pack. It may be that they're also evaluating their choices on which renderer to use. Who knows? Who knows? So that's a difficult question to answer, because I couldn't speak for what their plans are. But like I say, Mental Ray is now back in the hands of NVIDIA, isn't it? So we will see. We have it, and we're looking at it. It's historically been somewhat more difficult to develop for, because there wasn't documentation, which was off-putting. That may change, so we'll see.
Okay, cool. How about Corona Render?
Corona is fully supported. Well, there are certain limitations for renderers that aren't V-Ray, and that is only because V-Ray in its SDK provides functionality that isn't available in other renderers. So Corona is 95% of the features of Forest Pack are supported, but there are certain things like randomizing the animation that aren't supported by Corona, simply because their SDK doesn't support it. And so what happens when their SDK doesn't support a feature is that we will need to change ours so that they can then build functionality in their side. So it's going to be a bit of a joint effort to get that working.
What about
obviously, we're a small company and we have to work towards our clients' desires, and over 80% of our clients are V-Ray. I mean, obviously, this does not mean that we don't pay attention to other renderers, but having V-Ray as a major client base to use render engine, our main focus are on there, of course.
So what about Arnold? Same thing?
Yeah, Arnold, similar thing. Actually, although Arnold is in 3ds Max, there is no SDK for Arnold at present, as far as we know. We're basically the interface for Forest Pack to work with Arnold doesn't yet exist, and that's on Autodesk side. That we're working with them, I believe. So yeah, that will come, but it's not there until some changes are made on their side.
Okay. Do you plan on supporting a 4K monitor for Forest Pack and RailClone? Because it looks like at the moment, the RailClone and Forest Pack listers are tiny on 4K displays.
Yeah, we're aware of that, and that's on the that's on the list of jobs to do.
Good
with
news.
the new, yeah.
Well, basically, the roadmap for the rest of the year, we will be releasing a new version of Forest Pack before the end of the year. That will be Forest Pack 6, sorry. And then we will be thinking about a new version of RailClone for next spring. And in the meantime, there are other platforms in the radar, but obviously that's a decision that we have to make. It has to be thought quite carefully. We like Cinema 4D and we like Maya. Those two are those two platforms that are in the radar. But again, that's a tough decision being a small company, and that's something that we would like to think about from here to the end of the year. Obviously, Maya will be much more focused on the VFX section that we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, and Cinema 4D will be to cover more of the Archviz spectrum right now. But we have to think about it.
Okay. How about about RailClone? The question is, could you guys make it more visually friendly to introduce different controllers like bitmap and curve like Para 3D?
Yeah. So this is the request for kind of grasshopper-like functionality. Yeah, we've got RailClones. It's been a really interesting one because a lot of people have embraced it, and we have so many feature requests for RailClone. We've got a huge list, and that is on there. When or if that will be implemented, I'm not sure, but it's certainly something that's on our radar, and we know people want that. I couldn't speak to when or whether that fits in with the kind of core of RailClone, but it's certainly something. You're not the first to request it, and it's certainly something we are aware of.
Cool.
Sorry, that's a bit cryptic, but I couldn't say I couldn't speak for the developers on that one.
Okay. Would there be more presets and libraries in Forest Pack and RailClone in the future to support
Definitely.
more Archviz features? Yes, cool.
That's absolutely on the radar. Well, what we didn't mention there really, because it's not in Forest Pack yet, but we've completely changed the way we deliver libraries and presets, and so what should happen now is that they can be downloaded separately from the main package and managed via an updater, so we can push content out at any time without having to wait for a major release. And that could be whole libraries, whether they're commercial or otherwise, but in the case of RailClone, it could just be useful new macro nodes, which are a RailClone 6 thing, if you're not aware, but useful new macro nodes that extend the functionality of RailClone and give you new features that you don't necessarily have to sort of labor over creating your own graphs for, so sort of pre-packaged little bits and pieces you can use. And the same with Forest Pack. I mentioned briefly the Forest Pack effects feature there, but with the new library system coming in, there's no reason why we can't push out new effects as and when we create them. And that will make us a lot more agile and able to respond, I think. And also you'll be able, it's also useful because a lot of these things emerge out of questions we get asked like this. So people will ask us a question, we'll try and fix it with a macro or a forest effect if that's possible, because that's exciting for us to do as well. But then the nice thing then is that could become available for everyone immediately.
And in addition, we'll be announcing new partnerships with third parties before the end of the year, especially for new Forest Pack libraries. So clients should have access to much more material with the new version of Forest Pack.
Well, cool. We're looking forward to these announcements. And very good stuff, guys. And I'm not just saying it myself. I'm quoting from one of the attendees' comments. Okay, then there's a question for me. Is Novedge only for US customers? Let me see. I'm not sure. I'll let you know. Some software we can sell on in US, and I'm not, I know I should be more prepared. I don't know if we can sell Forest Pack and RailClone.
I can answer that one for you, Barbara.
Thank you.
You guys can sell anywhere.
Okay.
There's no geographical limitation for anyone.
Okay. Any planet?
Yeah.
Great. So
solar system, pretty much. So
come get it, guys. Great. Thank you so much. That's great news for me too. So, okay, this was the last questions. I'm going to take the screen back so I can properly say goodbye to all of you and remind you to check out our YouTube and Vimeo channels for today's recording. And this is where you can find iToo, Forest Pack Pro, and there's also RailClone on the Novedge product page. So come check it out, novedge.com, don't forget. And for information on specials, new releases, you can also join Novedge on Facebook and Twitter, Google+, we're all over. Next week, we'll have a webinar on rendering inside SketchUp with Tia for SketchUp. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Paul and Jaime. Looking forward to our next webinar already, maybe when the release 6 will be revealed. We look forward, and maybe something about RailClone. We're very excited to have you on board. Thank you so much.
great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Cheers. Adios.
Bye.